From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Well, welcome everybody. I'm John Haskell, the director of the Kluge Center. The center welcomes you, our staff welcomes you. The center, as some of you know in the room, brings together scholars from around the world. They both stimulate and energize each other, and they distill wisdom from the library's resources. And they also interact sometimes with the policymakers here in Washington and, of course, the public, like in this event. Kevin Schwartz, who's the feature today, is currently a researcher at the Oriental Institute of the Czech Academy of Sciences in Prague, where he focuses on Iran and the Persianate world. Previous positions include having been a Kluge Center Fellow here at the Library of Congress, so he's decided to drop by. Distinguished Visiting Professor and Chair in Middle East Studies at the Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland. Kevin's PhD is from the University of California at Berkeley. He has a master's degree from the Harvard University Center for Middle Eastern Studies and a BA from Columbia University. In this presentation, Dr. Schwartz uses tazkirahs, authoritative collections of Persian literary works, to map divergent conceptualizations of the world of Persian literary culture by connecting them to one another through their geographically and historically diverse use of documented sources and methods of cataloging and classification. Dr. Schwartz shines a light on how different individuals demarcated the conceptual and geographic boundaries of the 19th century Persianate world and shows the hidden value of the tazkirah genre as an historical source for documenting the intellectual, social, and cultural life in the wider Persianate world. Please join me in welcoming Kevin.
Okay, well, thank you so much for that kind introduction. Thanks for having me back. It's good to be back here at the Kluge Center, where I completed most of the research for this project. So I want to thank them for hosting me. Thank you to the Amid Reading Room as well, specifically Harad Dinavari. I wrote my dissertation in that lovely reading room about 3 years ago. It feels particularly appropriate to be giving this talk here at the library, surrounded by text, because this talk is about a library of sorts. And I guess previous to this research, I was more accustomed and conditioned to think about a library as this physically imposing stationary space, and I never thought about all the process of movement that undergird its functioning. It sounds a bit silly, but I just sat at my desk. I didn't move, the library didn't move, so not much was happening, but in fact, quite a bit was. Of course, libraries collect texts from near and far. They circulate and distribute them internally and externally. People come to use their texts, and of course through these texts, through these collections that are housed in a library, different people are connected, an author with a reader and two readers who are looking at the same text, maybe citing it in their own scholarly work, maybe paraphrasing it or plagiarizing it. And of course these processes of movement that undergird a library don't necessarily need to relate to a central physical location, but I think they also can relate to wider networks of text that aren't in one location and spread across a vast geographic land. And that's really what I want to talk about today, a trans-regional collection of text stretching across Islamic Eurasia in the early modern and modern period that served as a library of sorts, a circulating, accessible repository of text made available to users across vast lands who understood them more or less as a type of bounded collection. Now, using a collection of texts that are produced and circulating across an expansive geographic space, I think goes a long way in understanding how people were connected with one another through shared cultural, social, and textual norms on a trans-regional basis. And to highlight some of these features, I'm going to look at one particular type of text, arguably one of the most prevalent genres produced in the early modern period across all of Islamic Eurasia, a work written in Persian and dedicated to the recording of lives of Persian poets, and that is the tazkirah. And hopefully, I'll be able to first demonstrate how understanding these texts collectively as a library of sorts provides insight into a vast trans-regional space, constantly shifting and refashioning itself, and second, how mapping technology can elucidate these trends. So what I'll do is I'll break my talk into three parts. First, I'll look at the tazkirah, I'll kind of explain what a tazkirah is, some of its features, organizational methods. Then I'll explain how I went about mapping this tazkirah library, building my own database, and then we'll look at some of the shifts and transformations in this library, how it was constructed and refashioned itself, morphing and eventually contracting over time. So what is a tazkirah? Well, the etymology goes back to Arabic from the root dhakara, to recall or remember, and it could be loosely defined as a biographical anthology or biographical dictionary, as its purpose was to collect, collate, and organize the lives and activity of the individuals it sought to remember. And in this way, it may be thought of as a precursor to a who's who. And these texts can include entries on 10 individuals or thousands of individuals. And more importantly, it was a widespread genre that appears throughout Islamic history in different languages and formats. So it appears in Ottoman Turkish and Arabic and Urdu and Persian. It relates to the lives of scholars, Sufis, sultans, and of course, poets. And here you just see one of the most famous ones, Attar's biography of saints, and that's from the Library of Congress World Digital Library. It was actually originally in Persian, but it was translated into Ottoman Turkish. So I'm only going to focus on Persian texts about Persian poets, but I want to be clear that this constellation of text is embedded in a wider textual economy that is multilingual. So what are the major features of this text? Well, they're usually broken down into three parts. First, you have the introduction that includes praise, and that's praise for Allah, the Prophet Muhammad, and perhaps a patron. And after that, you have, in the introduction, the author's biography, where he gives his own biographical details and also lists the reasons for writing. So this is from a tazkirah, Bostani Surkhan, that's found in Hyderabad. And here, this panel is the beginning page of his introduction, and he's highlighted it with this word in red, ba'd, which is after. So basically, after I've given praise to Allah and the Prophet, now I'm going to tell you about myself. I'm going to tell you where I've come from, what I've done, and here's the reason for writing. After that, you have the text itself. And they're usually organized alphabetically, so all the entries with biographical details of the individuals followed by their verse. And here's again the heading, Fasal Aleph, so the section that begins with Aleph. And here's the first poet, Imam, whose name begins with Aleph, or his pen name begins with Aleph. And we have a couple lines about his life, how he was a good poet, he worked in Persian and Hindi. And afterwards you have his verses. Now, these texts in general can be divided into two types of organizations. First, you have the general type of tazkirah, which is an overview of poetry of previous centuries. So here, the author tried to represent the entire spectrum of Persian poetic production, including his own contemporary times. And these texts tend to be quite long. The longest one I found is Suhuf-i Ibrahim, which was produced in 1790s in Benares, and that listed 3,300 individuals. Now, opposed to that, you can also have a specialized text, which focused on remembering a more restrictive group, related to a court, one's contemporaries, literary salon, or geography. And based on what you chose, if you're going to write a general or specialized text, that's going to define, in many ways, your organization. So these grand compendiums of the whole historic production of Persian poetry are usually divided chronologically, ancients, moderns, contemporaries, some kind of variation therein. And then you have the specialized ones, which you have a whole variety of permutations. Maybe it's one geography, maybe it's one particular court where poets were active. The permutations are really endless. You have, for example, Shafiq Aurangabadi, who was talking about local poets during his time, and he divided his text according to those Hindu poets who produced Persian and Muslim poets who produced Persian. And now it's probably a good time to note that Persian poetry in its production wasn't restricted to one ethnicity, the Persians, nor was it restricted to one religion, Muslims. It was open to all faiths and ethnicities. Now, where you can break down these tazkirahs into two types, just know there is some overlap there. Even if someone's focusing on the dynastic poets of one court, they'll often situate it in relation to a previous reign, just to give you a little context. So there is some overlap, indeed. And how one constructed these texts, or how they organized them, was equally impacted by their own parochial intentions and their access to sources. So many authors were in search of patronage, sought out to record the lives of royals, an elite patron, poets of a royal court composing poetry. And this impulse to attract patronage and enlarge guests for a work can lead to the same author, in fact, reworking their work multiple times over adding to it, tweaking it slightly so it may be repackaged for a new patron. So in the early 17th century, you have the author Taqi Kashi from Kashan in Iran. He writes this work, he dedicates it to Safavid Shah, then he sprints across the Persianate world, he rewrites it slightly, slaps on a new dedication, gives it to another Shah to receive his patronage. I'm not going to be too critical of him, because tomorrow I'm giving a version of this talk, slightly different, but more or less the same. In addition to seeking out patronage, others compile their texts simply as matters of scholarship, trying to record the participants of an ever-growing core of Persian poets, whether in their immediate locale or elsewhere. And of course, as I mentioned, the way they organize these texts, or the way they construct them, was often based on the sources that were accessible to them. So for example, people who traveled. You had the author of Mardom Dide, who wrote his book in Aurangabad in India in 1761, 1762. He donned the garb of the Sufi wanderer, and he wandered around, started collecting verses. But he was very clear about the verses he was going to include. In the lives of individuals he would include in his particular tazkirah, it would only be those people he saw with his own eyes. Mardom Dide, people seen. And he comes up with 63 such individuals who he records in his tazkirah. What you're seeing here is just one little map to get a taste of it. I'll come back to it later. But here I've tried to plot the author movement from 1600 to 1900 so you can get a sense of how trans-regionally connected places in Iran, Afghanistan, and South Asia were. And what you're seeing here, you're seeing a dot, which signifies an author's birthplace, and then you have the line which signifies the route, and the arrow leading to the place where they produce their text. So just give you a sense of how far people travel to produce these texts for a variety of reasons, maybe in search of an opportunity or otherwise. Now, people didn't have to travel or don the Sufi garb. You could be like Riza Quli Khan Hidayat, who I'm realizing somehow makes it into all of my presentations. That one picture of him. He composed his Majma al-Fusaha, which was the largest 6-volume work in Fajar Tehran in 1871. He didn't travel, he sat at the court, he stayed put, and he let the texts come to him. And he took all these texts that were working their way up the bureaucratic network of the Fajar State, he used them and created this massive tazkirah called Majma al-Fusaha. I think his predecessor in Esfahan did him one better, Muhammad Tahir Nasrabadi, who wrote his tazkirah Nasrabadi, and he did so by hanging out in the coffee houses of Esfahan around Naqsh Jahan, which is right there. It's still existent today. It was built by Shah Abbas. And he went to the coffee houses, and there he kind of hung out, rubbed elbows with various individuals and poets. It was a kind of open mic night. People would talk and recite their poetry. Maybe they recite tales of other poets they heard about. People would come from far and near. And so he collected all these tales, just staying put in coffee houses, ended up producing this great tazkirah, which is an ode to Esfahan and all the people who came and conglomerated in it, and ends up being one of the most widely read and circulated texts moving forward. But most importantly, what was used for the compilation of tazkirahs were other sources. And so what happened was these tazkirah authors would come into contact with other works. They'd take bits from their entries, and they used them to compile their own works. These authors then took this information, culled from this trans-regional library, stuff they cited, paraphrased, repackaged, and used it to create their own tazkirah that was sent up into the trans-regional library, which would become part of a collection to circulate anew and used by other authors. So again, just like the previous map I gave with author movement, this is a map that shows tazkirah citations from 1700 to 1900. So the original dot is a source, the line is a route from where that source traveled, and at the end of the line you have an arrow that shows you a particular text. That text was used by it. So you have, for example, a text that's somewhere in central India, a lot of arrows coming to it. That means that one particular text used quite a bit of sources. And again, just as an element to show you how trans-regionally connected and interconnected this sphere was through text and tazkirahs. So I hope this very brief account of the tazkirah and its features is able to signify that it's really the ideal text to ascertain the ways people were connected through the production and circulation of text across a vast trans-regional space by participation in a shared literary sphere. And because it's known for the most part where and when these texts were produced, and because they often referenced other sources like you're seeing here, one can begin to map this literary sphere using digital technology based on a database. And I should add here that until recently, the tazkirah genre had been more or less disregarded by historians. People would go to it just to reference one particular verse of poetry to see if it was correct, or reference a particular birth date or death date of an author. So in the words of A.K.S. Lambden, she said, "Their interest, if any, to the historian is the witness they bear to the special literary bent of the Persian people and the place of the poet in society." Now, however, various scholars are using tazkirahs for a whole variety of projects to reconstruct individual biographies, uncover literary debates, reconstruct poetic networks, and a host of other issues. Now, my goal here is to take kind of macro analytical approach to the topic, a larger bird's eye view, leveraging quantifiable data to look at this literary sphere in general and understand some of its major features and how it's shifted over time. So what about doing? More or less all of last year was creating a database. Through primary and secondary sources, I created these own individual entries on an author and his text. So here you just see an example. I have the author's name, I have his place of birth. You can see I don't have his birth date or death date. For some I do, for some I don't. And of course I have the name of the text, the date of completion, and the place of completion. And I was able to create entries for about 200 texts between 1200 and 1900. But again, you can see I don't have information for every row there. And of these texts, I have geographic and temporal data for about 145 of them. That is the date and place of production. It's these texts that I use to map this literary sphere. So now let's look at some maps. Here's the growth and expansion of the tazkirah library from the period under discussion. This little video. And it takes a while to get going. There weren't many tazkirahs produced between 1221 and 1487. Just look for its expansion over time and where these texts are cropping out. Okay, I'll play it one more time if you can. Okay. Okay, so a lot can be gleaned from this map, particularly how tazkirah production's growth over time in different spaces intersected with social and political phenomena. So let's start in the pre-16th century, or pre-1600 rather. I mean, not much happening. There are a couple of texts that begin to crop up, beginning in 1221, in some courts that are emergent in Herat, and then later with the emergence of the Mughals in Delhi. But you can see this kind of migration of text moving eastward that's much in line with where Persian was moving at that time. In the 1600 to 1700 period, you really begin to see the emergence of Delhi. And this is very much in line with the rise of the Mughal states. The Mughals were an empire that ruled in India, based out of Delhi from 1525 to 1857. They lost power in the late 17th century, but Persian was their administrative language. And then finally, or not finally, but going on to 1700, 1800, now you see this map that shifts. Suddenly we have the migration of centers of production, leaving that center in Delhi and moving to other places in North India and either further south. And this is very much in line with what's happening at the time, which is the fracturing, the breakup of the Mughal Empire. So that core of Delhi is no longer there, but centers are migrating elsewhere. Poets are finding new opportunities to produce their texts and record various poetic activity. And I'll talk about that more in a moment. And then finally, in the 19th century, you see a continued relevance of South Asia, but suddenly you see an absolute explosion of tazkirahs in Iran. And this is in line with the Fajar State, which existed in Iran from about 1801 to 1925. And I'll talk about that in a moment as well. But all these vast tazkirahs that are being produced there are more and less in line with the rise of that state. So another visualization is to look at it this way, just see the growth of tazkirahs produced over time, and you could see over here, there's a steady increase from the pre-1600 period to the 19th century. But at the same time, that doesn't really give us an idea of how it intersected with political trends at the time. So what we need to do is break it down into smaller units. And here it's going to be a lot easier to scrutinize tazkirah production and the way it intersected with political events. And what you can see, and should be clear, is there are two intense periods of increased activity. One from 1725 to 1775, and one from 1800 to 1840. And so I'll talk about those two in turn. Why did you have these increased times of poetic production, of tazkirah production? Well, the first intense shift, the first kind of increased period of tazkirah growth was the result of political upheaval. So you had the breakdown of the Mughal state in the late 17th century. And this led to dispersal of Persian literatures throughout India, places in North India, but also places further south. And you had their increased participation in non-court literary organizations, which led to their amplification. And of course, you had the emergence of new courts. So you had successor states cropping up after the breakdown of the Mughal Empire, and that led to new opportunities for various poets and tazkirah authors. And just to remind ourselves to go back to this production map, that's basically what you're seeing here. So with the breakup of the Mughal Empire, you have a migration of various literateurs who are going to very North Indian urban centers like Lucknow and Agra, and they're also coming further south into the new court that was propping up in Hyderabad. So I think what you can say is two things about this shift here. Is one, it may be assumed that the fracturing of Mughal power further amplified the importance of already existent urban literary salons and social gatherings as major venues of poetic production and instigated a greater tendency among those participants to record their activity. So you didn't have the anchor of the state, you didn't have that umbrella of patronage, and what happened, these authors left. They started mingling with their friends who were non-court societal literary salons, and I think they felt this urgency to start recording that activity without the apparatus of the state behind them. Additionally, in the second instance, for people who were going south, like the state in Hyderabad, what these states did, they actually served as magnets attracting human poetic capital, individuals who were versed in Persianate literary and administrative norms from elsewhere. So these new states emerged, they had to rely on Persian administrators as functionaries, and so they served as magnets to attract various individuals. And one of the processes or effects, or one of the effects of this literary migration was the injection of a new crop of literateurs who were not only poets themselves, but carry with them tales, stories, and verse of other poets with whom they're acquainted elsewhere. In other words, the dispersal of literateurs following the fracturing of the Mughal Empire led to a higher concentration of poets in certain locales and the amplification of poetic activity there. And the growth of tazkirahs during this time, I think, is a reflection of this redoubled vibrancy. You can go back and look at the author movement map here, and this is the previous century before the Mughal kind of fracturing of power. And you can see there's a lot of transregional movement. People were moving from Iran and back to produce their tazkirahs. But in the period of Mughal fracturing, you really see a whole fluttering activity now around that. People moving around, finding new venues and new outlets to produce their poetry and record poetic activity. So the other intense shift, the other moment of increased poetic production is the emergence of the Fajar State. And that happens in 1801 or 1800 here. And 53 tazkirahs were produced in the Fajar. So that's 60% of the 19th century tazkirahs. And tazkirahs at this time really became a state project of producing, collecting, and collating works. And the Qajars, they used bureaucratic networks to collect all these works, send them up the bureaucratic pipeline, and create the ore text of poetic production relevant to their reign. So if in the case of India, the breakup of the Mughal Empire lent itself to a kind of horizontal distribution of tazkirah production, for the Qajars, it became a process of vertical integration, the collection of texts for outside localities in Iran into Tehran. In other words, they became interested in collecting information specifically in locales during their reign and throughout their lands to create a massive compendium to demonstrate their contributions to poetic culture. So from the early days of their reign, the Qajars invested themselves in reconstructing a library of tazkirahs. Serving as patrons, collectors, and composers, the ruling family helped churn the wheels of production and used the Fajar State bureaucracy to commission, collate, and compose works. The result was the transformation of a once decentralized library cutting across regions into one that was now circumscribed, to focus squarely on textual production in Iran itself. Royals, elites, and government officials served as the primary patrons of tazkirah production. The work of poets located in Iran during the Fajar period, many times the poetry of the Fajar period itself, served as a primary focal point. In other words, what they were doing is they were reconstructing this tazkirah library in their own image, localizing it and making it relevant to their own contributions. And here again, you can see tazkirah production. See, I misspelled production there. It's happening right around the center in Tehran, and even a better map of that is here. This is a kernel density map, which essentially is collating both geographic and temporal data to show you where the highest dense points of production are. And you can see while they exist in Esfahan and Shiraz, it's clearly centered around Tehran. So this process to remake the tazkirah library in their own image really begins with Fath Ali Shah and continues after his death. And you can see this decade breakdown of tazkirah production more or less corresponds at its height to his reign, which is right in here, and it's attributable to his efforts. So Fath Ali Shah, he commissioned works related to production throughout the lands, in particular places outside of Tehran. And Qajar elites themselves commissioned works, often in praise of themselves, in a host of cities. And these texts made their way up the pipeline to create more general works, which he did in his reign and his successors did as well. Now, we had some help in this regard. He had 48 sons, many of whom were scattered in various government positions across Iran, and eager to establish their own cultural bona fides, they had texts commissioned by their own local poets, oftentimes in praise of them, and these local efforts, too, were sent to their father so he can create his one overarching text. And even absent the commissioning of works, other works solely devoted to poets of individual cities, like Iyaz, Shiraz, Esfahan, and elsewhere, began to crop up. And even though they weren't commissioned by the Qajars, they were used for the same purpose. And again, we can go back to the author movement here and just see, unlike previous periods, there's not a lot of trans-regional movement leaving Iran. All of a sudden, there's all these opportunities to create text based on local circumstances. So obviously it's situated in Tehran, but there are places elsewhere where people didn't have to go very far or not leave at all to create their works. And those dots you see, those are relevant or signify people who were born in one place and also produced their text in that place as well. So again, something is definitely shifting here. There are now new opportunities for poets to record their local efforts, and all these efforts are being kind of funneled up into the central state and the bureaucratic pipeline to create massive texts under Fath Ali Shah and later, one of which is Majma' Fusaha, which we saw earlier by Riza Quli Khan Hidayat. The last example I think I'll give in this regard, how I think this literary space was changing and how this kind of trans-regional library was being localized, is by looking at citations. So while the citation of a text by another can mean a variety of things, from a scholar using the cited text as source to one simply wishing to pad their bibliographies, I think what it can tell us is how individual authors conceived of their literary universe and how they came to view their works. So here you have a citation network from 1700 to 1800, and again, it's quite vast. It interconnects places from Afghanistan to Iran and South Asia. And you have the same map here for the 19th century. So again, very vast. I would say there's more of a concentration internally in South Asia and Iran, but there's still those trans-regional connections. The only problem with this map is it's a bit misleading because it doesn't distinguish between authors citing a text produced in the 19th century versus the 13th century. So if an author used a text from the 13th century across the Persianate sphere, then it'll be mapped with a long arcing line. It doesn't tell us much about how local authors in the 19th century conceptualized the tazkirah library at that time. What we can do, then, what I've done, is to compare two texts that have vast citation lists in their introductions, and they occur around the same time at opposite ends of the Persianate world. One is Majma' Fusaha, which I referenced several times, which was produced in Tehran in 1871, and the Nigaristani-Sukhan, which is 1875 in Bhopal. And I think what you can understand through comparing these citation lists is how they began to see a more local and less trans-regional type of library, a shift that was happening certainly in Iran and also in India as well. And what's interesting comparing these lists, and they both list them in their introductions, so they're not just found in various entries, but they're very conscious about the text they're using, is that they only have 6 shared citations, and none after 1679. Additionally, they have no citations of text from the other side of the Persian literary sphere. So that means that a 19th century author located in Iran is not referencing any text of the 17th, 18th, and 19th century in South Asia. And likewise in South Asia, there's no reference to any text in Iran in the 18th and 19th century. So here's their kind of citation comparison. And you can see there are quite a few lines connecting them. Their shared texts are marked by some of these triangles. But again, all these shared texts occur previous to 1679. If you remove those and just select the texts that are produced after that period, you see that their conceptualization and their use of sources is certainly more circumscribed. So again, this transregional sphere based upon tazkirah production was being localized for a variety of reasons, particularly the efforts of the Qajars during that time. I think that's a good place to leave things. I hope I've given you a small taste of the transregional Persianate sphere in the early modern period, and how highlighting the various features of one particular genre of text, and how through conceptualizing them as a library and the use of mapping technology, you could begin to understand how a vast transregional space grew, developed, morphed, and eventually contracted. Thank you very much.
Can we ask questions?
Sure.
I'm curious about a couple of things that are very insightful. Thank you for a wonderful talk. On one of the maps, in the earlier ones, you showed a few sites in Central Asia as well. And then I think in the bigger Fajar one, there's a couple of items from, or at least one spot in Baghdad. I am curious, the works that came out of Baghdad, I assume had to do with the Fajars. Am I correct or am I wrong? How much tazkirah writing or Persian sort of writing was done in Baghdad? A. B. In Central Asia, was this sort of original anomaly that kind of did its own thing and didn't really connect with either the South Asian or the Arabian one, or was it more connected?
Yeah, very good questions. First, with the case of Baghdad, so I'm just trying to pull up the 18th to 1900 map. Yeah, I forget this exact text. I mean, that text is certainly an anomaly. There aren't many Persian tazkirahs being produced then. I mean, as furthest as you kind of get into the kind of multilingual sphere will be happening up in Tabriz, and you do find collections of texts that are including of Turkish poetry or Azerbaijani poetry. As far as Central Asia, you can see there's really a big gap. I mean, most of the texts from an earlier period are actually produced in Central Asia, mainly around Herat and the court of Hussein Baykara. And one of the most famous texts, Tazkirah al-Shura by Dawlat Shah Samarkandi, comes out of there. But beyond that, I don't have many citations for Central Asia. Does it mean they exist? It means the sources. Yeah. 1682. Yeah. I think it's Samarkand, but I'm not. Yeah.
Okay. And so it's sort of its own thing, or was it connecting with the?
No, I mean there were connections. I mean, I don't remember that exact entry, and I don't know a lot about all of these exact entries. There's 200 of them, or 144 in this case. But no, you certainly had examples of literateurs going from Central Asia and producing tazkirahs in South Asia. Some of them might just not exist at the time. I think that there are quite a few Central Asian tazkirahs to be discovered in the 19th century. And that's where I think the real big gap is. And again, I think for me, it's a consequence of access to sources.
By the time you get to this map,
yeah.
This is the second part, it's clearly become regional. There is the more and more Iranian sense of Persian that's Iranian. And we see in India, the last map you showed with the blue, really showed how it became regional. And the authors that were developing in all of India, north and south and what have you. How much of what's happening in India developed in India actually had an impact in Fajar, Iran, A? And B, would you say that this is the beginning of what has now become the problem of the Persian version, in which it's become very nationalized by nation states? And I also think maybe in Afghanistan, because the ruling elite were Pashtun, act on identity and not so much connect onto the classics of Persian that would then make it a non-regional, make it connected to the larger region.
Yeah, I mean, no, this is the rise of, I think, Persian nationalism, literary nationalism in Iran that seeks to really redefine the boundaries of Ajam. You know, Ajam, the place, you know, of Persian production, or Persian served to the lingua franca, I mean, it was expansive. But in this time, it begins to shrink. And one of the prime movers in that is this Sabki Hindi, which is understood to be this, you know, really abstruse, difficult to understand, negatively impactful style. And, you know, I talked about this in my dissertation, but it's really the prime mover. I mean, what people like Hidayat, and I keep on coming back to Hidayat, but other people do, and going into the early 20th century, is they pick up on this notion that there was this bad type of Persian poetry floating around and necessitated the rescuing of Persian poetry by the Iranians. And they went to this Bazgash movement where they rekindled the spirit of the ancient masters. They went back to Rumi, Hafez, Sadi, and Ferdowsi. And that is pretty much the nail in the coffin that begins to separate the two spheres of the time. So, I mean, Sabki Hindi was a big impact later on when people began to conceptualize the borders of Ajam. At this point, though, I mean, people weren't really thinking in those terms. I think they were just thinking really, really locally. I think people all of a sudden realized that local tazkirahs had relevance, that you could praise a certain ruler wherever they were, usually one of the Shah's sons throughout Iran, and you'd get some kind of largesse for it. And also that there were opportunities now in the Fajar State that didn't exist, certainly in the 18th century during the kind of Nader Shah period, but also in the Safavid period as well. So I think there was kind of this renewed vigor to collect and record poetic activity. But I mean, you're right though, things are happening where it's fracturing, and these places where Persian is still existent, at least represented through tazkirahs, are kind of dying out. They're becoming enclaves or islands unto themselves. And there's other reasons for that too. There's the rise of the British, there's the rise of Urdu.
Thank you for your talk. This is my first experience with Persian literature besides Rumi. So a couple of things that came up for me. One was, you know, your thoughts of where the movements of
That looked at author.
they don't go eastward. So I'm wondering if has anything been found as, you know, along trade routes in China, that's Persian. And my second question was why coffee houses, the coffee house writer, why not tea? And I don't know if I'm making any sense.
No, so
But it just surprised me, and so I was just wondering why that might be. And I thought, oh, is it church? Great.
no, well, these representations are very much a consequence of me solely focusing on Persian tazkirahs of Persian poets. So I think the most kind of prolific tazkirah that goes really outside into regions that I haven't highlighted have to do with Sufis. And you definitely find Sufi tazkirahs in Uyghur China. There's a recent book about it. And so that's definitely existing. You'll find tazkirahs of Persian and travelogues and all different types of texts of Persian in various places, Thailand, Nepal, Sri Lanka, what have you. As far as coffee houses go, I can't answer why it was chosen over tea, but in the Safavid period, they did crop up all around that square, Naqsh Jahan, which is still existent today and still has a lot of coffee houses and meeting places. And that was just a space for poets. The Safavid court at that time didn't really have a lot of opportunities for poets. So most poets who wanted to make money, they'd either go to India or they had another job. They were usually craftsmen during the day, and at night they'd go hang out in the coffee houses and recite their poetry. And luckily they had this one amazing archivist, essentially, who sat there and recorded all their works.
Women poets?
Yeah, there are some, and some of these tazkirahs are solely devoted to women poets. I mean, there were a small proportion. But even in the Qajar times, there's a tazkirah that's related to women poets, and specifically those of the Shah's harem. So they usually tend to focus on royal families. It's much harder to find kind of on-the-street women poets going back to early and modern times. But certainly you find tazkirahs of royal elite women who are composing poetry.
So essentially, just if you were to do an outline, is that more and more there was a sort of regional development of Persian, and it had nothing to do necessarily with trends that had anything to do with cross-region. It was just a phenomenon of the east, and one end of the Persianate-speaking world not really being familiar with what was happening on the other end because it was so vast that there were regional sort of centers. Is that a good way to?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think it's a good way to explain tazkirah production at this time, that there seems to be less trans-regional overlap, but certainly not for Persian language and literature in general. I mean, a lot of the great newspapers in Persian were cropping up in Bombay, they were cropping up elsewhere in Istanbul, and they were crucial in the constitutional revolution. And of course, you have trans-regional connections among the Parsi community and their impact on both philology and education in Iran. So, I mean, that's the one thing I have to square. And you know, again, it's a consequence of trying to use mapping and keep it restrictive so I could actually map, you know, a select group of texts and not have to map the entirety of Persian literary sphere, but also be kind of more attuned to those trends. Because, I mean, trans-regionalism was still happening. It just wasn't happening in the way, you know.
You're focusing on the test.
Right. I mean, it's going to have to be situated in the larger kind of trans-regional moment. But I think that's, you know, definitely, again, one drawback of this work that doesn't bring in different texts. And so that was my caveat at the beginning. This is a whole kind of multilingual sphere. There's a whole other, you know, genre going on with tarikh and tabaqat that also are kind of integrated into this space. But for purposes of practicality, unless this is crowdsourced, I just had to focus on tazkirahs.
Is the database live yet, or is it on?
No, it's an ongoing project. And the idea is to have more people contribute to this and start creating entries for Urdu tazkirahs as well. And you begin to see a big trend in mid-19th century South Asia where most of the tazkirahs of Persian poets are actually being produced now in Urdu. So they're written in Urdu, but then you have the actual selections that are in Persian because they're about Persian poets. So I'm hoping people will get involved on that side of it. I mean, there are tazkirahs for Ottoman Turkish. But again, it's kind of a vast project, but I really wanted to show also the ways in which you can use this kind of mapping technology to understand trans-regionalism. Well, if there are no other questions, thank you so much for attending. It's 4 p.m. on Friday, so I really appreciate it. Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.